Well, it's an honor to be back at Sheffield this year to talk about a project I'm working on called Voyager. It's a series that reimagines content from the Golden Record in virtual reality. It's also a project that has a special preview here as part of the Alternate Realities program, so thanks to Dan, again, for believing in it and having it here. And to some of the volunteers, I think Andrew's here, thanks buddy, who've been here helping me do this, and Igloo for housing us. In an effort to keep on time, which I've clearly not done, and to keep me relatively on track, I'm going to be reading, because I know myself, so I hope that's okay. First, for some context, back in 1977, the NASA Jet Propulsion Laboratory launched 2 space probes, Voyager 1 and Voyager 2. The first part of their mission would involve running various science experiments around our outer planets, Jupiter, Saturn, Uranus, and Neptune. Not Pluto. Sorry. After these experiences were finished, the probes would slingshot themselves towards the edge of our solar system and head on into interstellar space, where their second and final mission would start. Attached to each Voyager probe was a message from Earth in the form of a 12-inch gold-plated copper phonographic disc. On this record is a selection of images, graphs, greetings, sounds, and music that represent the breadth of life and human experience on our planet. These materials were curated by a small team that was led by Carl Sagan and included Ann Druyan, who's also the lead advisor on this project with me, John Lomberg, Frank Drake, Ellen Lomax, and others. It included work by Time Magazine, the United Nations, and artists like Ansel Adams and Chuck Berry, greetings from nations all over the world, a message from then-President Jimmy Carter, and whales. The assumption being that aliens who get the message might understand whale more than us. In my previous life as a filmmaker, I would return to this material for inspiration and to keep myself grounded. It's also why I have the only tattoo I will probably ever get, which is hydrogen, as seen here. The most basic form of matter on Earth is also the symbol on the record to tell the aliens how fast to play the thing. And then VR happened, and I was suddenly met with the notion of creating worlds and connecting visitors to those worlds I was creating, and how every person who visits a world comes from his or her own world of unique memories and experiences. Planet Earth is teeming with microworlds, many which remain unvisited by the vast majority of its inhabitants. And as a result, we remain predominantly alien to a planet that we call home. If the Golden Record was to show intelligent life beyond our solar system, what it was like to be on Earth, perhaps VR might allow the record to serve as a message of connection and understanding for the people of Earth, a way to once again celebrate our differences and challenge the preconceived notions we have about our own existence. And that's how this all started. So I want to talk briefly about 2 of the chapters. The first is Beethoven's Fifth. For those who can, the act of hearing is a powerful thing. A spatial recording of a room piped into some headphones convinces us we're somewhere else. A piece of music can throw our minds to other times, places, and people instantly. It can connect us to reality one minute and detach us the next, and it can be graceful and violent, sometimes at the same time. Beethoven's Fifth is all of those things for a person who can hear. And it made me wonder what it might be like for someone who could not. There's a book by Oliver Sacks called Seeing Voices, and in it he speaks about a test that was conducted with a group of deaf Chinese students and a group of students of normal sight and hearing. Both groups were shown Chinese characters in the dark with a laser pointer, and the results were remarkable. The deaf students were able to recall in precise detail the characters drawn in the dark, much better than the students who could both see and hear. They determined that when one lost her ability to hear, the other perceptual abilities compensated. The brain reshaped itself. The result in the case of deafness is something that looks a lot like long exposure photography. And that image is actually something that's on the record, the gymnast from Time Magazine. Sachs calls it movement parsing, and it's why something like sign language is as effective as it is. I was once accosted by a professor at MIT who will go nameless, but there's a guy named Casper who might know who this guy is, who told me excitedly about how the brilliant Helen Keller, who was deafblind, so could not see or hear, was able to actually hear Beethoven. She had put her hand to a radio during a broadcast of Beethoven's Ninth Symphony, and through the vibrations, Ms. Keller could tell the difference between the woodwinds and the brass, the singing and the violins. And it seemed that Beethoven, who was stricken by his own deafness, had inadvertently, or perhaps purposely, been a composer of music for the deaf. Keller writes, As I listened with darkness and melody, shadow and sound filling all the room, I could not help remembering that the great composer who poured forth such a flood of sweetness into the world was deaf like myself. I marveled at the power of his quenchless spirit by which, out of his pain, he wrought such joy for others. And there I sat, feeling with my hand the magnificent symphony which broke like a sea upon the silent shores of his soul and mine. And to be very honest, normal perception is fairly limited. We only hear, at best, a small fraction of the waves that exist in the universe. I explored this a bit with something called Deep Dream VR, and I'm fascinated by the notion of intelligence systems helping to challenge our perceptual abilities, and the possibilities of integrating that kind of thing in VR are endless. It also made me wonder if there was something to what Voyager 1 could see and hear that I could use in this experience. Dr. Ed Stone, who had been the lead space scientist on the Voyager mission for the past 40 years, pointed me to a man by the name of Don Gurnett. Don has an instrument mounted to Voyager 1, which essentially records the sounds of space. Interstellar space makes a tone, and it sounds like this. It will sound like this. You're not getting it? No? Okay. It can sound like what that looks like. No. Let me see if I can I undo this for a second? Let me see if I can. No. Well, that sucks. Yeah. Oh, there you go. You got it. Yeah. Yeah. Oh. Thank you. That was worth the wait, right? Beethoven suffered from a condition called tinnitus, well, there's another way to pronounce it that I can't, but it's a persistent ringing in the ear, and a lot of us have it with varying intensities. And when I played the examples of tinnitus and these interstellar space sounds back to back, which drove me kind of nuts, it sounded like a conversation, like whales calling to each other. Now there's a thought. What if Beethoven's disability wasn't a disability at all, but a connection to something greater? Anne Drury once mentioned to me how she felt she needed to take care of Beethoven, that her putting his music on the record was a way of setting him free. And I honestly felt similar, and bizarrely so. When we talked and we both had the same idea, it really kind of took me aback. We both were wondering what we could do for Beethoven. Beethoven's Fifth became a loose story about demons finally being released in a journey home. As consequence, Beethoven's Fifth is also a celebration of human perception in all its forms. Performance from the London Philharmonic Orchestra, and dip in and out of this journey into interstellar space, which is a visualization achieved by using data collected from Voyager 1 that made that journey. The performance and instrumentation throws you to different parts of the room. There's movement parsing, the sounds of interstellar space, even tasteful tinnitus. In addition, the team at Subpack gave us these really great backpacks for install here, so you're actually able to feel Beethoven, much like Helen Keller might have felt it. A funny thing to note about the London Philharmonic Orchestra, I started talking with them last year here at Sheffield about VR, and they were starting to do some really great stuff. And when I talked to Luke, who was their digital director, he basically looked at the content on the record and realized that Beethoven's Fifth was performed on the record, and it was performed by the London Philharmonic Orchestra. So it felt like it was the right match. Navajo Nation is another chapter that is currently in the prototype stage, and it's a collaboration between myself and a team called Google Spotlight Stories. Okay, VR editing 101. At its core, editing for the medium of film is achieved by linking frames together. But in VR, we don't deal with single frames, we deal with worlds of potential frames. And so editing in this medium is achieved by linking worlds together. My job as an editor is to pull someone through this universe. Does that take away from the truth of editing? Absolutely not. In fact, it's pretty spot on. But that's assuming that there's a coherent journey to begin with. I had been warned that the Navajo, though through no fault of their own, are culturally fragmented. When I went to Bluff, Utah to film at the Navajo State Fair, there was a lot of competing opinion within their own community of what was actually Navajo and what wasn't. For example, I was told that I should film the powwow by one group, but then I was told very sternly by an elderly Navajo man that the powwow is not Navajo. It's not any one specific tribe, in fact. Most powwow ceremonies are intertribal. Dancers from around the area, regardless of tribe, come to these events, get numbers, and compete for money in genres like grass dance, fancy dance, and northern traditional. I had many of these pockets of experiences. It's weird to call anything in VR traditional, but trying to edit this footage into a single journey was extremely hard because that connective journey tissue just didn't exist. There were these pockets and vignettes that resonated with me, but I was struggling to find the connection between them. And if I did try and force it, I would be creating something inauthentic, not just creatively, but culturally. Misrepresentation is something that is a result of us trying to be an objective force of connection. This kind of misrepresentation does actually exist on the Golden Record. It was done, as it's sometimes done, very innocently. The image of Monument Valley, for example, is flipped. The original one on the record is to the left, and the one that we actually found the vantage point for is on the right. The song, the Navajo Night Chant, that is on the record is actually called the Yebache. It's only performed at very specific times of the year and cannot be seen or heard otherwise. But now it's recorded, floating onward for billions of years in space, beyond the Navajo's reach or prevention. A limitation of film is its having to represent a culture through a single string of frames and in a one-off form. Not only does a frame force us into a single, in some ways deadened perspective on something that's much softer and malleable and very much alive, it misrepresents by virtue of having to oversimplify something that is vastly more complex. And in VR film, in 360 specifically, the world of frames notion gives you much more context and broader perspective on a culture with a different takeaway depending on where you put your attention in the space. But I realized that the real through line through these disparate cultural pockets was the act of the journey itself. More specifically enabling someone to have that journey through these pockets on her own. In order to fully realize that, it was time for me to leave the passive 360 world for a second, which was a big move, and think about interactivity. When I hear the phrase choose your own adventure, I cringe hard. Because how you're able to choose and why and when feeds into the overall narrative of the experience you're in. Interactivity is a powerful thing, and it serves as an added contextual layer to an experience. With the Navajo, I thought on what was most important to them and why. Cardinal directions, north, south, east, and west, and what they represent. Turquoise, a very meaningful stone in color. Structures and architecture, specifically the hogan. Even how the Navajo would actually welcome a newcomer, given their history of dealing with newcomers. As an example, they might welcome you to a rodeo or a powwow, but keep the culturally sensitive experiences at a distance. So considering all of that, Navajo Nation works like this. You find yourself in the middle of Monument Valley, in the dark, the beginnings of a sunrise. Around you are 4 turquoise hogans, polygonal and alien-looking in each of the cardinal directions, and each of these hogans has within it a vignette of Navajo life. The hogan housing a vignette on rodeo and cowboys is the biggest and in the north, a direction representing evaluation of what one has learned over time and how that is implemented. There's the powwow in the west, the Navajo guide Larry Holiday and his connection to the land in the south, and there's Grandma, tucked away in the distance, furthest in the east. You can go to any of these vignettes by gazing at one of the hogans, and when you're ready to leave any of them, you just simply look up and you're taken back to Monument Valley. When the experience begins, so do each of the vignettes, meaning they go on with or without you. They exist with or without you. They don't wait for you to show up to start, and they don't wait for you to come back to continue. There is a large chance that you visit a vignette and you miss something, such as life. The sunrise acts as a timer. Once the sun is up, you're transported back to Monument Valley. Now bathed in sunlight, the hogan's no longer there. The edit is motivated by your own journey between this cultural multiverse in progress. You essentially jump between 5 trains running at various speeds. Time in each of these vignettes is different depending on the pacing of the subject it focuses on. Grandma is patient, the land is still, the rodeo is frantic and a bit awkward, and the powwow is driven by beat and rhythm. You can also go to one place, all of the places, or nowhere at all. You can just watch the sunrise. That's totally fine. Each experience is unique, but all the journeys are of active exploration and discovery through a landscape encoded with the culture it represents. The next phase of Navajo Nation is to go to Bluff and have an open conversation about the introduced cultural elements to see if I've got something very wrong, if something's missing, or if there's something more we can do. And while I'm excited about getting them more involved with this, allowing that culture that's represented to own and inform that representation, I remain cautious. One of my favorite scenes in Navajo Nation, if you can catch it, is this ride breaking down. I suppose it's a strange thing to feel like home, or to feel something like home when seeing something like this, but I do, because I grew up in a town that was small and our rides kept breaking down. I was also struck by how the scene outside the window of the train coming to Sheffield is always oddly similar to that of what it looks like when I'm on the train going home to York, Pennsylvania, which is where I'm from. York, PA is a factory and farm town filled with good, hardworking people who wave at you when you pass them. It's also Trump country. Now, you might think that growing up in a place like that, especially someone that looks like me, might be a bit tricky. And it was actually quite the opposite. It was an amazing place to grow up. I was accepted, supported, loved, and the most violent act of aggression on me in York County There's a fun fact about wild turkeys. So the one leading the charge is a woman. She's the hen. And all the dudes are just following her, not quite sure what's going on. The best responses to VR I have ever gotten came from folks in towns like York, Sheffield, and Bluff. And yet they're the last to get access to these technologies. Accessibility is more than content being on a particular phone or headset. It's tied to infrastructure, it's tied to income, to location, to health, and it seems that the people who need VR the most are usually the last who get it, if at all. The Golden Record was not just about content. They thought long and hard about the record itself, how the content could be compressed and put on something that could survive for billions of years in unexplored space. They didn't know what was out there, but they knew if they had any chance of delivering a message, they needed to think critically about how they would communicate and deliver that message. And I'm left wondering, what's this for VR? People want this stuff, and sometimes being at these festivals gives us a false impression that it's easy, but it's not. We really need to think about accessibility critically, so someone doesn't automatically lose because of who she is or where she is, because of her income, because of her age or disability, or I found to be super ability, as I've grown to know it through the Beethoven piece, or even nationality. It's all we want, all of us, in the real world or the virtual ones, is to feel a sense of togetherness, to feel like we're important, that we matter, and that we belong. We all deserve that feeling. And it's my hope that Voyager can help us get closer to that. Thanks so much.
So, questions? Who's got a question?
You can eat the turkeys. They're edible. I know that was a pressing
That was on everyone's mind.
Yeah.
David.
Hi, thanks for that.
Sure.
Question, if I heard you correctly, and maybe I didn't, but I think I heard you say that linear film, and then you were comparing it to VR in terms of editing. VR being perhaps better able to show or to create an experience that portrayed the nuances of cultures. Did I hear correct? And can you just talk a bit more? Can you talk a bit more about that?
Sure. I mean, generally, like in the stuff that I do, what I really like to embrace is the ability of someone to be able to turn. I don't really subscribe to in this one section, everything happens, and then everything else is just sort of left blank for purposes of getting someone to kind of hone in on certain things. And I think that there's an ebb and flow in experiences that you edit together that can then provide both like a moment of chaos where you can see anywhere and you get the idea versus something that's more pointed. And experiences in the real world generally fall into that line, right? Sometimes you look at me right now, sometimes you're out in the crowd. And so I feel like there is more room for a culture to breathe and to be explored and to be a bit more alive and not have necessarily like one perspective, one window into a culture. That said, I feel that there's some really interesting things to do within interactivity, and that's why I was speaking most specifically to Navajo, where when we think about interactivity and we think about the way that we construct these worlds and the cadences and the flows, how that each of those decisions we make can be informed by stuff that's very specific to the culture. That we just don't make these decisions based upon our own experiences or how we feel, but really think about how they feel. And I feel that there's a lot of work we can do in that space. And I think there could be a really interesting, I don't know, like a different genre that kind of comes from that. I think the documentary can go there and it could be quite powerful.
Hey, Jessica. I saw both of your experiences yesterday and thought they were, really different to anything else that I'd seen. But I was really interested to see that you didn't have a voiceover on either of them. And I just wondered what your thinking was behind maybe not telling us, one person's story.
Yeah, voiceover for me is a bit strange. With Navajo especially, I didn't want there to be subtitles. I wanted it to be Navajo. So if they spoke Navajo, it was Navajo. If they spoke English, it was English. I think that seeing another layer on top that gives you like a translation, again, separates us from what's actually happening. I feel that breaks not only immersion, but the cultural connection there. I shouldn't have to have them speak English because I only understand English. And I think that, especially Navajo is such a beautiful language, and I think it just musically and emotionally is very, very wonderful, and I like having it. With Beethoven, I felt like, the music speaks for itself. It's driven by the mind of somebody who was going through some considerable pain and trying to connect back to this thing that he loved so much, but he was slowly, little by little, drifting away from it. And, I talked to Esa-Pekka Salonen, who's the conductor for the London Philharmonic, and he's the one that actually started getting me on this thinking about Beethoven, the man, Beethoven's, kind of how his brain worked. And it wasn't about any one singular story or idea. It was about feeling and perception and just, if you felt something, then it worked, and it was fine. So I wanted to keep that looser than before.
Thank you. I saw Beethoven yesterday.
It was great.
I thought it was very beautiful. And I have a question for you. I thought it was very beautiful, but I wanted much more Beethoven in the sense of his point of view. I am blind. I am just transitioning from blindness from filmmaking, traditional filmmaking, to interactive and so on.
Sure.
And I missed more of his POV. I thought that I saw the images, the orchestra. Sometimes I said, oh, wait, because I wanted to be with him.
Yeah,
Did you ever have that tendency to go with him rather than staying with a real visual imagery?
No, I get caught up in it so much because, you start to fall in love with the characters that you're representing in some way. It became more about him the more that I got to it. And the way that I sort of dealt with it, because this idea of time, to me, is also a very interesting thing, the human construct of how we deal with our lives in this temporal way. And I don't know, I think that in the mix, that's why I was sort of trying to have it be more like you were in his head and like you were connecting with this orchestra in some way, but then you're being thrown back out to Voyager 1 where you were there kind of reuniting with this sound that's been in your head for so long. So I really do think it was this kind of dichotomy between like you purely being him later, and then you sort of remembering what it was like to sort of have your stuff performed, and the transcendence of that to some other form. And yeah, I mean, we also talked about like, I mean, if I had the money, I know I work at Google, but if I had the money and the, you know, the computer power to do a visualization of going into interstellar space and just keep going using this data visualization for as long as I could, I would. You probably wouldn't be able to get me out of a headset that way. But yeah, no, I think it's just a decision that we made just based upon, you know, kind of what we were trying to achieve in the end of it. But I agree with you, yeah, it's part of me longs for that too.
Any more questions? Last question. Who was first? Okay.
I don't know.
Okay.
Hi, Jessica. I just wanted to ask you, you mentioned there that you like the idea and it's important to you that these things get seen by people not necessarily in the big cities, but, you know, people outside of that.
Yeah.
And I just wondered, I don't know how much, you know, you get involved in formulating the kind of distribution plans for your own work, but what is, for example, your plan with these two projects? How will they come to a broader audience, obviously, than is here today? Thanks.
Yeah, I mean, I thought a lot about this too, because, you know, and it's been kind of an interesting thing because you're trying to be the creative person that makes this stuff, but then you're also thinking about like, okay, well, how does this inevitably, like, how does this end up? What's the broader story here? And so these are just two of the chapters of what is going to hopefully be much, you know, many more that come from this. Collectively speaking, something we're thinking about is web VR, something that I'm very passionate about just as a concept, just because you can widely distribute it. You don't even have to have VR to be able to experience these things. You can have a Rift, you can have a Vive, you can have a Daydream headset. It's very, you know, it democratizes this stuff. That still doesn't address things like infrastructure, or, you know, I think a lot of it comes down to, when I say this, I mean this with all due respect to what I'm trying to achieve, but like, you know, the user experience. Who's the user, like, who's the baseline thing? And I think the way I'm going with it too currently is, if someone in Bluff, Utah can't access it, then something's very wrong. So, and if I'm going to be representing them and they can't access even that just feels wrong. And so I'm going with that currently. So yeah, I don't know. I mean, it's something that's going to constantly be in progress, and this stuff is, as you all know, is changing and evolving every day. Like, something breaks 1 second and is fixed the next second, then something else breaks, and so it's just like constant evolution of the technology. But I think each piece should be able to live and be on its own as well. So like the Navajo piece could probably be something that I could install there in Bluff, Utah, just locally, so that they have access to it. The London Philharmonic, you know, piece can go all sorts of places and, you know, be there. It's going to Sonar after this. And even other creators I've been talking to, I've encouraged and said, look, don't think about this as having to be like the record thing. Like, it's only just a platform from which you can then sprout like larger ideas about how we exist here. And then, you know, I want you to use that on your own to show your work and show what you're thinking about and talk about it independently. And that's what all these different entities, Time Magazine, United Nations, and so on, they all had stuff that they had already captured for their own purposes, and then they brought it to the record. So I want to sort of, you know, run those both in tandem as well on this project. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, we're talking to some folks, so if any of you are interested, just, you know, let me know.
Thanks very much.
Yep, thank you.
Thank you.